The punch that nobody saw ended the career of the most feared man in boxing. 63 seconds after the opening bell, Sonny Liston was on his back. Muhammad Ali was standing over him screaming, and an entire arena was booing because they thought they'd been cheated. What happens when the most important moment in your career is the one nobody believes actually happened? Lewiston, Maine wasn't supposed to host a heavyweight championship fight. The town had 41 Salozan people, most of whom had never seen a professional boxing match in person, and the venue, a converted hockey arena called St. Dominic's Youth Center, could barely hold 500 spectators. This wasn't Madison Square Garden. This wasn't the glamorous stage where champions were supposed to be crowned. This was a last-minute substitution, arranged after Boston pulled out due to concerns about Sonny Liston's connections to organized crime and threats of violence that had been circulating for weeks. The FBI had agents in the building. The press was skeptical, and Muhammad Ali, walking into that arena on May 25, 1965, could feel something wrong in the air, something that smelled less like opportunity and more like a setup for a disaster nobody could predict. Why does history's most controversial knockout happen in the least likely place? Liston had been different in the days leading up to the fight, not the usual menacing presence who terrified opponents with his stare, but quieter, more withdrawn, as if he'd already resigned himself to something. He'd barely made eye contact with Ali, and for a man whose psychological warfare had once been his greatest weapon, the absence of that intensity was notable. Ali had noticed. Everyone had noticed. The boxing press whispered about it. Was Liston sick, injured, or was something else happening? Something the mob bosses who'd controlled much of his career might have arranged. The betting lines had shifted strangely in the final days, money flooding toward Liston despite most experts favoring Ali after his dominant performance in their first fight. Someone knew something, or thought they did. But what? And how could anyone prepare for a fight where the outcome might have been decided before the first punch was thrown? The arena felt empty, even with people in it. Less than half the seats were filled, the rest cordoned off or simply vacant, creating echoes where there should have been roars. The lighting was harsh, institutional, nothing like the theatrical spotlights of major boxing venues. It felt more like a high school gymnasium than a championship fight. Ali had entered to scattered applause and boos. He was still Cassius Clay to many, the loud-mouthed kid who disrespected the sport by joining the Nation of Islam and changing his name, who'd beaten Liston in Miami but hadn't convinced everyone it wasn't a fluke. Liston came in to polite applause, the former champion trying to reclaim what he'd lost, the ex-convict looking for redemption that America wasn't particularly interested in granting him. Two men, both complicated, both carrying baggage that had nothing to do with boxing, about to create a moment that would confuse and frustrate people for decades. Can a fight be legendary and suspicious at the same time? The opening bell rang. Ali came out dancing, as always, moving with that impossible speed that made heavyweights look like they were fighting underwater in comparison. Liston moved forward slowly, stalking, the way he'd always fought, grinding oppressive, looking to land the big shot that would end things. They circled. Ali threw a few jabs, testing, measuring. Liston blocked them easily. Nothing unusual yet, just two fighters feeling each other out the way fighters do in opening rounds. The crowd, small as it was, watched with the anticipation that comes before violence, that held breath before impact. 40 seconds passed. 50. The round was barely a minute old when Ali saw the opening. Liston's left hand dropped slightly, his head came forward, and Ali threw what he'd later call the anchor punch. A short, fast right hand that traveled maybe 6 inches and landed on Liston's jaw. What nobody could agree on afterward was what that punch actually looked like. Was it devastating? Was it barely there? And could 6 inches of movement really end the career of a man who'd absorbed punishment from some of the hardest hitters in boxing history? Liston went down. Not collapsed, not crumpled, but down. First to his knees, then rolling onto his back, his face showing something that looked more like resignation than pain. The crowd's reaction was immediate and wrong: confusion instead of excitement, suspicion instead of awe, because nobody had seen it clearly. The punch had been so fast, so compact, that even people sitting ringside couldn't say with certainty what had connected. The referee, Jersey Joe Walcott, a former champion himself, looked as confused as everyone else. He started counting, but Ali didn't go to a neutral corner. Instead, he stood over Liston, screaming down at him, "Get up and fight." "Sucker! Nobody's going to believe this!" His face was contorted with something between rage and vindication, as if he knew even in that moment that his greatest knockout would be the one nobody credited. Why was Ali so angry when he was winning? What did he understand that the rest of the arena was still trying to process? Walcott's count was chaotic. He got to 6, maybe 7, then stopped because Ali was still standing over Liston, not in a neutral corner where regulations required him to be. The timekeeper at ringside was counting differently. He'd reached 12, maybe 14, pounding the canvas to signal Liston had been down too long. But Walcott couldn't hear him over the noise of the crowd, which had started booing, convinced they were watching theater instead of sport. Reporters had jumped into the ring, surrounding the fighters, creating more chaos. Liston started to get up, then lay back down. Ali was being pushed toward his corner by Angelo Dundee, his trainer, who was screaming something nobody could hear over the pandemonium. And Walcott, overwhelmed, waved the fight back on, signaling both fighters to continue even though Liston had clearly been down longer than any 10 count. What happens to a knockout when the referee forgets how to count? Can victory exist if nobody acknowledges it happened? The fight continued for another few seconds. Surreal, illegitimate, with everyone in the arena knowing something had broken in the fundamental structure of how boxing matches were supposed to work. Ali landed another punch, cleaner this time, and Liston went down again. This time Walcott stopped it, 1 minute 44 seconds into the first round, the shortest heavyweight championship fight in history at that point. But the number that mattered was 63, the seconds between the opening bell and that first, controversial knockdown. 63 seconds to create a mystery that would outlive both fighters. Ali's hand was raised. He'd won. He was still champion. But the boos were deafening, rolling through the small arena like waves of disgust. They thought they'd been conned. They thought Liston had taken a dive. They thought Ali was complicit in a fraud. And standing in the center of that ring, with his hand raised and the crowd's hatred washing over him, Ali experienced something he'd never felt after a victory: the hollow taste of winning a fight that nobody believed he'd actually won. Is it possible to be both victor and victim in the same moment? The locker room afterward was chaos of a different kind. Reporters crowded around Ali, not asking about his technique or his strategy, but demanding to know if the fight had been fixed. Was it real, Cassius? They shouted, refusing to call him by his chosen name, adding insult to suspicion. Did Liston take a dive? Ali's response was heated, defensive in a way champions shouldn't have to be. "I hit him with a good punch, a sneak punch. He went down and he stayed down." But his voice carried an edge of desperation, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as them. Angelo Dundee tried to run interference, explaining the anchor punch was a legitimate technique Ali had been working on, a short right hand designed to catch opponents off guard. Some reporters wrote it down. Most didn't. They'd already written their stories: Phantom Punch ends Liston, Clay rematch in controversy. The narrative was set before Ali had even taken off his gloves. How do you prove you're legitimate when everyone's already decided you're not? Liston's locker room was quieter but more ominous. He sat on a bench, barely speaking, answering questions with grunts and shrugs. When pressed about whether he'd thrown the fight, he said, "That punch hurt." It was a good punch, but he said it with no conviction, no passion, like a man reading lines he'd been given. His handlers looked nervous. The men in expensive suits who'd followed him from his corner stood near the door, watching who came in and out. Organized crime had controlled much of boxing in the 1960s, and Liston had been connected to it his entire career. Debts owed, favors traded. the kind of entanglements that made people wonder whose interests he was really fighting for. Had the mob told him to take a dive? Had they bet against him and arranged the outcome? Or had he simply been old, past his prime, legitimately beaten by a younger, faster opponent but unable to accept that reality? The truth died with him 5 years later, when he was found dead in his Las Vegas home under circumstances that were never fully explained. Can a man take his secrets to the grave when the world has already decided what those secrets must be? The film footage was analyzed obsessively in the days and weeks that followed. Frame by frame, experts tried to determine what had actually happened in those 63 seconds. Some claimed they could see the punch land cleanly, Ali's right fist connecting with Liston's jaw at just the right angle to scramble his equilibrium. Others insisted the footage showed nothing significant, that Liston had gone down from a glancing blow that couldn't possibly have hurt him. The famous photograph, taken by Neil Lafer, showing Ali standing over Liston with his right arm extended and his mouth open in a primal scream, became iconic, one of the most recognizable images in sports history. But iconic isn't the same as conclusive. The photo captured dominance, rage, theater. It didn't capture truth, and that ambiguity became the story's lasting power. Because everyone could see what they wanted to see: a legitimate knockout, a fixed fight, a tragic end to a complicated career, or the birth of a legend willing to do whatever it took to win. What does it mean when the most famous photo in boxing history documents the sport's most disputed moment? Ali would defend that punch for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, when Parkinson's had slowed his speech but not dimmed his conviction, he'd talk about the anchor punch, demonstrating the technique with trembling hands, insisting it was real, it was effective, it had ended Sonny Liston's career legitimately. People didn't see it because it was so fast, he'd explain. But Liston felt it, and he went down. The defensiveness never fully left his voice when discussing it, as if that night in Lewiston remained an unhealed wound, a victory that felt like being called a cheat. For a man who'd built his identity on being the greatest, on proving his superiority in ways that couldn't be questioned, having his most spectacular knockout treated as his most suspicious must have been a special kind of torture. How many times can you tell the truth before you start wondering if the truth matters less than what people believe? The boxing world remained divided. Some respected analysts came to Ali's defense, pointing out that short punches can be devastating when timed perfectly, that Liston's chin had been suspect in previous fights, that the idea of a fix made no sense given how much money Ali stood to lose if the public turned on him. Others remained skeptical, noting the mob connections, the strange betting patterns, the fact that Liston never put up a real fight in either of his matches with Ali. The Nevada State Athletic Commission investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The FBI, which had been monitoring both fighters for various reasons, also concluded the fight appeared legitimate. But official findings couldn't change public perception. The conspiracy theory was more interesting than the truth, whatever that truth was, and in the absence of certainty, people chose the narrative that fit their existing beliefs about Ali. Hero or con man, genius or fraud, the greatest or just the loudest. When did the fight stop being about boxing and start being about who you wanted Muhammad Ali to be? The rematch that never happened haunted both men. Liston would fight 6 more times, winning 5, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He'd become a cautionary tale, the invincible man who'd been destroyed twice by the same young opponent, the second time in a way that stripped him of even the dignity of an honest loss. He drank more, grew more isolated. The mob connections that had once seemed like power revealed themselves as chains. When he died in December 1970, officially from a heroin overdose, though his wife insisted he didn't use drugs and the circumstances were suspicious, the boxing world barely mourned. He'd become an embarrassment, a reminder of the sport's corrupt underbelly. Ali, by contrast, went on to become exactly what he'd promised, the greatest. But that night in Lewiston remained an asterisk on his record, a footnote that couldn't be deleted. Every time someone listed his greatest knockouts, They'd mention the phantom punch, always with a qualifier, always with doubt. Can you be the greatest if your most famous victory is the one people least believe in? Years later, a sports journalist asked Ali if he ever wished the punch had been more obvious, if he regretted that his greatest knockout looked suspicious. Ali had paused, considered, then given an answer that was uncharacteristically philosophical. Man, I don't control what people believe. I did what I did. Liston went down because I hit him with the perfect punch at the perfect time. That's boxing. That's what happens when you're faster than the other man can see. Maybe people needed it to be fake because they couldn't accept that I was that good. Maybe they needed Liston to take a dive because admitting I beat him clean meant accepting something they didn't want to accept about who deserved to be champion. I don't know. What I know is this: I was there. I threw it. I felt it connect. And Liston went down and didn't get back up when it mattered. The rest is just talk. The interviewer had asked if that answer satisfied him, if being right was enough when nobody believed you. Ali had smiled that famous smile, diminished by disease but still recognizable, and said, "Being right don't pay the bills, and it don't change people's minds. But it lets me sleep at night. Most nights. Anyway, what does it cost a man to be doubted at the moment of his greatest achievement? The 3 seconds in Lewiston became a litmus test for how you felt about Muhammad Ali. If you loved him, you believed the punch was real, that he was so fast and so skilled that he could end a fight before most people even saw what happened. If you hated him, you believed he was part of a fix, that his arrogance and his mouth had corrupted even his victories, that he represented everything wrong with modern boxing. And if you were uncertain about him, and many were, confused by his politics, his religion, his refusal to fit into the boxes America preferred for its black athletes, then the phantom punch was just more evidence that Ali was complicated, dangerous, impossible to categorize. The truth became less important than what the moment revealed about the person interpreting it. Can a single punch contain that much meaning? Or do we just need our sports heroes to be symbols we can either worship or destroy? Liston's ghost never left Ali. In later fights, when opponents would go down quickly, Cleveland Williams in 3 rounds, Zora Fawley in 7, there would be whispers, suggestions that maybe Ali's knockouts always came too easily, that maybe power wasn't his real weapon so much as something else, something less mentionable. It was unfair, deeply unfair. Ali's speed was documented, his technique studied, his victories over genuinely great fighters, Frazier, Foreman, Norton, proven beyond doubt. But the suspicion planted in Lewiston grew roots, subtle but persistent. Even his supporters had to preface their praise, yes, the Liston fight looked suspicious. But everything else so. Why should everything else need a but? Why couldn't the body of evidence speak for itself? Because boxing has always been corrupt, people assumed. Because where there's smoke, there's fire. Because sometimes people need to believe in conspiracy more than they need to believe in excellence. And Ali, for all his greatness, couldn't punch away a rumor. How do you fight an opponent that doesn't have a body to hit? The photo remained. Long after the controversy faded from immediate memory, long after most people forgot the details of the fight itself, that image of Ali standing over Liston, arm extended, mouth open, the perfect embodiment of athletic dominance, became the visual shorthand for his entire career. It appeared on magazine covers and documentaries, on posters and T-shirts. Divorced from its context, it looked like pure triumph, the hero vanquishing the villain. But for those who knew the story, who remembered the boos and the suspicion and the asterisk, the photo carried a shadow. It was a moment of victory that felt like defeat, of vindication that required endless defense, of certainty that the world refused to share. And maybe that's why it endured. Not despite the controversy, but because of it. Because ambiguity is more interesting than clarity. Because questions outlive answers. Because the image of Ali screaming down at Liston captures something true about greatness. It's never as simple as it looks, never as clean as we want it to be, always complicated by context, and doubt and the messy reality that heroes are just humans trying to prove something to a world that's already decided what it wants to believe. Does the truth matter if the myth is better? 60, 3 seconds, one punch, one knockdown, one photograph, and 60 years of argument about what really happened in a converted hockey arena in Lewiston, Maine, on a spring night in 1965. Sonny Liston never fully explained what he felt when that punch landed, if it hurt, or if he'd been told to go down, or if he'd just been beaten by a better fighter and couldn't admit it. Muhammad Ali never stopped insisting it was real, never stopped demonstrating the technique, never stopped defending a victory that should have been self-evident. The referee, Jersey Joe Walcott, took his confusion to his grave. The reporters who were there wrote conflicting accounts. The film shows something that could be interpreted a dozen different ways depending on what you want to see. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the phantom punch is called phantom not because it didn't exist, but because proof and belief are different things. And sometimes the most important moments in sports are the ones that refuse to be settled. Maybe Ali became immortal, not despite the controversy, but because of it. Because 60, 3 seconds of doubt gave the world permission to keep talking about him, keep arguing about him, keep trying to solve a mystery that has no solution. And maybe Liston's tragedy wasn't that he lost, but that he lost in a way that made him look complicit in his own destruction, a final humiliation from a sport that had never treated him with dignity. Can both things be true? Can the punch be real and the fight still feel wrong? Can Ali be the greatest and Lewiston still be a stain? Or are we asking the wrong questions, demanding certainty from a moment that was always meant to be uncertain? What do you believe? And more importantly, why?